War Pugs. Today we're going to be learning about the Krasny whatever. History of Everything has continued on his series about telling us how the pre-Russian Navy, the pre-Soviet Navy, the Soviet Navy, and the post-Soviet Navy is about as embarrassing as you can possibly get, okay? The sheer fact of the matter is, I already knew the Russian and late Soviet Navy was a pile of hot garbage, and the Russian military was a pile of hot garbage before they sat there and decided to invade a sovereign country and then promptly ran out of gas in the same amount of distance it usually takes for me to go get something from Best Buy. But, yeah, we're here for more of this because, you know, I've already lost a lot of faith in humanity. Why not lose a little bit more, you know? Because people actually did this. This was done by people. And, frankly, there is no end to human stupidity, and it seems to be concentrated in certain areas. War Pugs, we're here for Soviet naval tales, or as I prefer the name of the series of this as it was, which is The Russian Navy Sucks. But even my pugs are going ape upstairs over this, and they need to be quiet because I'm trying to record, but still. Oh yeah. So, let's just get into this. History of Everything. I know he's going to be checking this out. This is always a pleasure to check out something from History of Everything. And even in this snapshot of this particular ship, they carry spare anchors. I'm just done. I have nothing. Let's go. Let's find out about this. Let's roll right into it. War Pugs. Be sure to check out the description down below. I'm going to be putting the link for this video down there. Be sure to subscribe to History of Everything. Let's rock into it.
The Soviet Navy is one of the most interesting naval forces in the world, and it really always has been. There is a clear evolution between Tsarist Navy to Red Navy to modern Russian Navy, and throughout history you have a case of either pure competency and brilliance, such as Rossosvensky and the crew of the ship we're going to be talking about today, or you have this. The light, well technically heavy cruiser, but we'll get to that, Krasny Kavkaz, is a great example of this kind of incompetent insanity born from desperation to appear big on the world stage, and while not entirely a story like that of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, K-19, or any of the other ones we looked at, it is rather quite interesting in how the Soviet Union threw a bunch of pig iron onto a floating hull and tried to pass it off as brilliance.
Shmakolka.
What is even more surprising is somehow the crew managed to channel voodoo from Rasputin to make it work. But how do you get to this point? Well, let's find out.
What?
But first, a word from today's sponsor. Call of War is a free online PvP strategy game, and in it, you can choose a real country to lead from World War II. Forge alliances and make enemies with up to 100 players in real time, games that will last weeks on end. Using tanks, planes, or even the bomb, choose your own strategy and take over the free world. For me, Call of War is the perfect game to play when you just need that immersion and kick from history. Or if you're, well, stuck in an airport, like I have been for the last few years, non-stop because of work. It really is the perfect game if you're ever stuck. You can play on both your PC and your mobile, but more importantly, note that there is an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription for free by clicking the link in my description below. I'll also include it in the pinned comment. This is available for only 30 days only, so be sure to be quick. And thank you again for Call of War for sponsoring this video.
Guys, sorry for the background noise. I'm going to go take care of that real quick. The dogs are festive. Ah, the joys of pugs. You have them, they bark, they snort, they fart. There we go. Let's get into it.
Now, once the Soviet Union was established, the innocent people were terrorized for owning a particularly nice sock and the white Russians were massacred. The state of the Red military was somewhere between crap and inept, and quite a lot of work was needed to make it able to stand for longer than 5 minutes against the great enemies of the Soviet Union of equals. It's not an empire. It was an empire.
Yes, it was.
For those who say it wasn't an empire, it absolutely was.
People are stupid sometimes.
The Navy, in particular, coming off the back of being treated worse than a weeaboo's anime body pillow in 1905 against Japan, and then having some marginal success but really just a fair bit of sadness and nothing in World War I,
Dude, that was cold.
was in an even worse state. To the Russian Empire's credit, it had managed to get its proverbial shit together following the Russo-Japanese War, and had churned out a pretty decent fleet. Nothing particularly amazing, mind you, but the new dreadnoughts of which, although they look a bit how-do-you-do, were actually quite good, all things considered, and above all, the Tsar's Navy had managed to churn out some pretty damn good cruisers and destroyers.
Okay, here's the thing. Soviet ships usually weren't that bad. It was the crews on them. Because I don't understand the method of thinking, but it was like, let's design a ship that could literally tear a continent in half. And then let's not train a single person in the operation of said weaponry, said equipment, at all. Let's just not do it. And let's just find out what happens. It's a joke. It's a damned joke.
The Ottomans were easily now matched in the Black Sea by these new ships, and the Germans were in the position that on the one side they had the British looking menacingly, and on the other side they had a particularly decent sized navy that could quite easily work towards the kind of warfare known as the Juna, or the small war at sea. Now you may ask, Juna, that sounds French, not Russian. Well, yes it is. It's the kind of warfare at sea invented by the French, who had spent the best part of 100 years from 1700 to 1800 being in a particularly violent relationship with the Royal Navy. The idea was, and this is a bit of a simplification, that a lot of cheap boats could hold off and defeat the enemy with a smaller number of big boats. So, sort of swarm tactics. Mm-hmm. There is an extent that it does work. See what Ukraine's doing in the Black Sea at the moment with drones. You can use smaller ships to defeat bigger ships. Lots of smaller ships, fewer bigger ships. It works out. And the Italians did this with great effect during the First World War, using mass boats to sink an Austro-Hungarian dreadnought. But let's be honest, you don't willingly engage in this kind of warfare if you can afford ships, and if you have ships. The simple fact was, France at the time couldn't afford ships anywhere near on the scale the British could, and Russia, in 1914, after the aforementioned anime body pillow treatment by the IJN, could not exactly afford a battle fleet to go head-to-head with Kaiser Willie's pet navy. So what does this have to do with a Soviet cruiser from 1932? Yeah, I'm getting there, hang on. The Soviet Navy, technically founded in 1918 but only given actual time to breathe and organise itself following the Civil War in the early 1920s, was in a state somewhere akin to a university student's liver during orientation week. It had lost most of its surface warships during the war to either joining the White Corps, getting sunk, or in general just falling apart, because let's be honest, with the state of the Russian Empire in 1917, and later the Soviet Union, maintenance wasn't exactly a known word, and, well, understandably so.
You can't really confine it to that time period because, as we found out, maintenance isn't a high priority at any point for the Russians, apparently. I mean, I don't understand why not, but just look at the door until it rusts off and see water starts coming in. It'll be fine.
This doesn't excuse them for forgetting what maintenance is after the war and into the 1990s and present day.
Oh, thank you. We have redeemed ourselves.
For this period, we'll give them a bit of a pass.
No.
The Soviets, rightly having the brain power to understand that they can't dick measure against the Western naval powers, probably time to point out that Lenin was in charge, not Stalin, yet, decided to go around and look at the different partially completed hulls sitting on the slipways around the Soviet Union. Some particularly enterprising fellows made their way into the Ukrainian SSR to the Mykolaiv shipyards, and noticed that there was a 60% completed hull floating around the harbour called Admiral Nazar. Initially it was laid down in 1913 and launched 3 years later. The ship was intended to be completed as one of the new light cruisers that I mentioned at the start of the video for the renewed Imperial Russian Navy after Tsushima. Given that the Soviet industry wasn't the best, this practically new, albeit quite rusty hulk bobbing around the harbour covered in enough weeds to double as a set for Jurassic Park was a godsend and would allow the Soviets to start reconstituting the Black Sea Fleet, which was in a really bad state, following all the war, and if it came to it, it would have genuinely been in a lot of trouble had the Turks and Soviets ended up at each other's throats, which, let's be honest, there's a bit of historical precedence there. And
little.
It's quite sad when you realise it, because the Soviets, well, the Russians before the Soviets, had a fleet that could easily wipe the Turkish fleet out, or the Ottoman fleet, later Turkish fleet. Then the Civil War happened, and then, well, the Soviets inherited pretty much nothing. As an interesting anecdote, the cruiser, if you can call it that given its state of completion at the time, had already been owned by the Russian Empire, then it was captured by the German Empire, then it was handed over to the Triple Entente, and then the White Russians, and then finally the Soviets got it. But anyway, moving on. It is now 1927, Lenin has died, Stalin is now the god emperor of the Soviet Union, and the Admiral Nazar and his sister ship Admiral Nakhimov, also bobbing in the harbour, have been selected for completion.
Yay!
The slight issue with, though, is the size of the ships. Although they are both cruisers, the difference between a cruiser from 1913 and 1927 are quite remarkable. For comparison's sake, a light cruiser built at the same time in the United Kingdom, the HMS, later HMNZS Leander, was 169.1 metres, or 554 feet long. It was armed with 8 6-inch turreted guns, and it was around 9,700 tonnes at full load, and it could cruise at 32.5 knots, and it had a tremendous cruising range. Our hero, meanwhile, as designed, was 163.2 metres, or 535 feet long, but only 7,600 tonnes, and armed with 15 single-mount 5.1-inch guns with a speed of around 29 knots. While the difference between 5.1 and 6 inches doesn't sound like much, it is, I'm sorry to say. In gun caliber, get your mind out of the gutter. Not to mention the...
I missed that that's what she said joke, and I will forever be shamed over it.
advantage of turreted guns under direct fire control rather than the single guns. And although the size doesn't sound tremendously different in length, 163 meters versus 169 meters, that weight is huge. Had Leander come into contact with a ship like this during the Second World War, or just after its completion, both of their completions, Leander would have absolutely crippled her old relative from before the First World War. This isn't me trying to insult the ship, it's just pointing out the limitations at the time. An extra 5 meters, along with an increase in tonnage and just advances in design, really do make a difference. The Soviets were well aware of the limitations of these older ships' hulls as well, and after completing the first hull of Chervonok Ukraina to the original design, it was decided in an attempt to modernize, something radical would be done with the second hull, now known as Krasny Kavkaz, the Red Caucasus.
Time for definitions.
Tangent here. For those who don't know, the difference between a light and a heavy cruiser is purely down to gun caliber, and it is really outlined in the naval treaties following the First World War. Prior to the war, you have all manner of cruisers, scout cruisers with tiny quick-firing guns, light cruisers with around 5 to 6 inch guns, and then armoured cruisers, usually with 4 big guns and some smaller ones. And of course, the king of the cruiser, the battle cruiser, with all big guns. It is all a bit complicated, but they all had perceived roles.
Now, a lot of this was laid down in something called the London Naval Treaty, and it was put in with all of the major powers, major naval powers at the time, to basically restrict the size of naval vessels, because back before World War II, before people realized carrier warfare was going to be a thing. So today, carriers are considered a sign of a nation's economy and prestige. How many carriers they're able to field. But back in the day, it was battleships, okay? Back in the day, it was flat out battleships. And the more battleships you can field, it was the big swinging dick competition of nations back then. How many battleships do you have? And the London Naval Treaty was to stop countries from building bigger and bigger battleships. Prior to World War II breaking out, several countries left that treaty. Some in particular being, I believe Germany left it a lot later than some of the other countries did. But Japan was one of the first ones to do it, and that's why the Yamato had a single gun turret that was heavier than an entire destroyer. Let that sink in, because they said they left the treaty and started designing these massive ships that would just, if they got in range, would tear anything to ribbons. Luckily, carriers were a thing. and warfare changed in a big way.
Jutland and Dogger Bank really showed just how out of place the armoured cruiser was in the modern world, and it would die off very quickly following the war, with the only remaining armoured cruiser in the world being the Greek museum ship Georgios Averov. Scout cruisers were also becoming so outmatched by even destroyers that they were now deemed to be, well, essentially pointless.
Mm-hmm.
The light cruiser survived as a good middle ground, but what if you needed something slightly bigger, especially now that battleships were being limited? 6-inch guns were great, but they just didn't cover all the bases. Again, get your mind out of the gutter, not like that. Sometimes a navy just needs a bit more, and so the heavy cruiser was born. For the sake of simplicity, like I said, the only real difference between a heavy and a light cruiser is the gun caliber. Armour does not come into this at all. Take a look at the French heavy cruisers from the interwar period. Those things had basically paper for armour.
Right.
And the new, well, newish Soviet cruiser Shivana Ukraina with 5.1-inch guns was very weak, when it comes to being a light cruiser, that is, compared to our contemporaries in 1927, let alone the ships that were being planned. The Soviets therefore had this idea that they could fit twin 8-inch guns to the hull, that was fitting out, 8 of them in fact, which, off the bat, was just an insane idea because they, for one, just wouldn't fit, and two, if you did put these guns on it, it is questionable whether the hull could handle the weight, let alone the recoil.
Right.
So back to the drawing board, and the Soviets were really quite intent on putting a big gun on the hull.
Something about that. I keep on jutting my own little nuggets of knowledge in there. They had with battleships, even as heavy as battleships were, they did something out of fear, mind you. They did not fire all the guns at the same time. And the reason they didn't do this is there was worries that they would capsize the ship if they fired all the guns at the same time. But even while they were firing, the recoil of the guns would push the ship sideways in the water. That, if you ever get a chance to go to Hawaii and get a chance to stay on, get a walk around on, I believe it's the Missouri that's out there. That's a museum ship out there. If you ever get a chance to walk on that thing, imagine that thing going sideways in the water from the recoil, the guns that you're looking at. That, if you've ever stood on a battleship, seems almost impossible.
With orders from high up to make a strong cruiser, the design team really had no choice. It was either make a big, strong, heavy cruiser or, Stalin. Granted, he wasn't purging everyone yet with the liberal application of brass to the upper skull. He was just implementing policies to starve everyone north of Mykolaiv shipyard to death.
Hey!
Either way, it is the Soviet Union. You do as you're told.
Yep.
Somebody took a look around though and noticed the Soviet Union had this big gun that just might fit in the form of the BL 7.1-inch Mark VI naval gun. A 7.1-inch gun would satisfy the need for the ship to be upgunned and far more capable than Shivana Ukraina with her 5.1-inch guns. Slight issue though, the ship could only fit 4 instead of the 15 smaller guns, again due to size limitations, and the weight was now pushed up to 9,000 tons on a full load, almost equaling the much larger Leander-class cruisers I had mentioned before. So you have a smaller hull that you're just stuffing more things into.
This
can only go well.
No, it's not.
Krasny Kavkaz would therefore be finished as the powerfully armed 7.1-inch armed cruiser, which by definition could be considered a heavy cruiser-ish on the world stage. Her superstructure and funnels were redesigned to form a sleek and powerful looking vessel that signaled the return of the Great Russian fleet to the world stage. At least that's what the propaganda said,
right?
Or the outside said. The reality was not entirely the same. The Krasny Kavkaz, well yes it was armed with 7.1-inch guns, it only had 4, in single turret mounts, and this was in 1932. For comparison's sake, the Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned the cruiser Takao in 1932 armed with 10 8-inch guns. The United States at the round time was introducing the Northampton class with 9 8-inch guns. The British, Italian and French fleets were also commissioning ships with at least 8 8-inch guns, which doesn't bode well for any kind of plausible engagement the ship might find itself in with a foreign power, save for maybe Turkey, which, let's be honest, precedents aside, wasn't exactly going to get involved in a conflict during the interwar period. It had its own internal issues. In an attempt to flaunt the power of the Krasny Kavkaz, a big emphasis has been made upon how fast the shell velocity was from her guns, giving her the incredible range of 38.5 kilometers or 23.9 miles. Now this is a really impressive range, especially when you compare it to the equivalent British 7.5-inch guns in the Hawking class cruiser. It is less impressive when you consider the ability to hit anything at this range is the equivalent of a near-Confederate succeeding in their attempt to speak to a woman. That isn't a direct relation. Well, yes, it is true these guns technically outranged everything else comparable in size. Soviet fire control at the time was not exactly the best or remotely on par with Western systems, and further...
Soviet fire control, to say that at the time they weren't on par, I mean, you could say for all time has not been on par, because they've been an embarrassment since the start, and they haven't stopped being an embarrassment since then.
Further to that, the guns weren't exactly the most stable, nor were the mounts the best.
Oh, Christ.
Although they aren't as bad as the mounts on the Kirov-class cruisers, but that's another thing entirely, and I'll get to that at a later date. Further to that,
I
the
can't
gun
wait till he
itself
talks
could
about
only
the
fire a
Kirovs.
few dozen rounds before the barrel needed to be replaced. Yeah, that's right, a few dozen rounds, which is just astronomically bad. Turns out stuffing the gun with cordite to make the shell go far doesn't actually make your gun better. For comparison's sake, that British 7.5-inch gun I mentioned, yeah, its average life expectancy for a barrel was 650 full charges, which, you know, is quite a bit more. Not to mention the speed was relatively slow. Now, 29 knots isn't bad by any means, but it really isn't great when you compare it to the low to mid-30s that other cruisers at the time were pulling off.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, in their attempt to make a powerfully armed cruiser, in reality, the Soviets produced the nicest looking turd to ever sail in the Soviet Navy, entering service on the 25th of January, 1932. Initially, the ship would take part in cruises around the Black Sea, Greece, Turkey, and Italy, showing the flag and such, and in this role she was seemingly quite effective. At the time, it is worth mentioning the USSR and Fascist Italy were quite close, particularly when it came to naval development, and many of the ships the USSR would field during and after World War II had their roots in Italy, such as the Kirovs that I mentioned before, destroyers too, like the Tashkent.
The Great Patriotic War. World War II, for anybody that doesn't know.
Krasny Kavkaz would have a relatively quiet career largely due to geography and her base in the Black Sea, meaning that she took no part in the early stages of World War II, in which the Soviet Union allied with Nazi Germany, invaded Poland, and later alone invaded Finland. However, come June 22, 1941, the ship would be engaged on almost the very first day of Operation Barbarossa during the bombarding of Sevastopol by the Luftwaffe. The naval war in the Black Sea honestly warrants its own video, but the situation was thus that the Soviets held a numerical advantage in firepower over the Axis powers, able to call on the battleship Parishkaya Kommuna, Paris Commune, 2 modern cruisers, 4 older ones that had varying levels of rebuild, including Krasny Kavkaz and Shabana Ukraina, 14 modern destroyers, and then a smattering of older ships. The Axis, meanwhile, had 4 destroyers of varying use and some smaller ships. The big equalizer, though, was that during the initial stages of the war, the Axis had total dominance over the skies. With the rapid Axis advance into the Ukrainian USSR, the Soviet Black Sea Fleet would therefore find itself playing the role of convoy escort, resupply, and gunfire support. There would be no major fleet engagements, and this was helped by both the Montreux Convention, but also the fact that the Italian Navy was busy bit now being slapped around by Cunningham and HMS Warspite with their never-ending plot armour. On the 11th of September 1941, the Krasny Kavkaz fired her guns in anger for the first time on German forces approaching Odessa, and she would further have the task of ferrying naval infantry into Odessa and the surrounding regions to assist with the defence of the city, making multiple runs between Sevastopol and Odessa and acting as a floating fire support battery. A standout moment of the ship's wartime service was her participation in the Kerch-Feodosia landing operation on the 28th of December 1941. After taking aboard around 1900 paratroopers supporting light artillery and vehicles, the ship forced a landing whilst under fire in Feodosia Bay. The cruiser would take 13 hits from German coastal batteries, leaving gaping holes in the vessel that were plugged with whatever could be found. According to Soviet records, a German shell penetrated the armour of the cruiser and exploded in the second turret amongst the ammunition, and whilst the flames engulfed the powder bags and very nearly spread to the ammunition store, which would have certainly destroyed the ship, a sailor named Vasily Pokutkin regained his composure following a hit, and unable to in any way to throw the flaming bags overboard or flood where he was standing, he threw his body onto the flames to snuff them out, and suffered horrific burns to his body because of this. The next day, the ship was attacked 25 times by aircraft. On the 4th of January, the ship would again return landing more troops but would come under attack by Stukas, being hit with her stern thrown out of the water and her right propeller thrown off, and the left propeller shaft becoming gravely damaged. The ship would take on 2,000 tons of water and settle deeply into the ocean, keeping in mind she was already massively overweight. And by some miracle, the ship made it back to port on the 3rd of April 1942. And due to this action, she would be awarded the Guards title. As the Soviet lines advanced, the role of the Black Sea Fleet became less and less important, and the Krasny Kavkaz would find herself relegated to far less risky operations. By this time, the ship had engaged in at least 30 combat operations, including 9 fire support missions, 2 mine clearance operations, and the continuous transport of soldiers. She had travelled 14,000 miles and transported around 25,000 soldiers, and assisted in evacuation. Surviving the war, the Krasny Kavkaz would be relegated to the role of a training ship before being retired and expended in a test of the first Soviet anti-ship missile, the SSN-1, in 1956. The Krasny Kavkaz represents in many ways the very best and the very worst of the Soviet Navy. On the one hand, you can truly see what can and did happen with Soviet vessels when they had competent commanders and crews. The ship undoubtedly paid for herself and punched so far above her weight it's not even funny during the war years.
This is true.
And yes, this has helped a fair bit by the fact she didn't have to engage in surface warfare with any contemporaries, of which she 100% would have lost.
It would have been laughable. It would have been laughable at best. She was armed with a third of the power. It would have been horrible. But luckily, from what he's telling me and from what I'm hearing, especially after the attack from air and the attack from the Germans, she had a competent crew, which a competent crew goes a long way.
On the other hand, the Krasny Kavkaz is a clear example of a solid idea, that being the rebuilding and expanding of the Russian, now Soviet fleet by making use of whatever you have available, and then ruining it by attempting to make mega thing bigger. In many ways, it is not too dissimilar to the modern Kirov-class cruisers, sometimes called a battle cruiser by the wrong people. In a rush to make the biggest and greatest thing, the Soviets put to sea a colossal behemoth that has to partially sink itself to fire its main weaponry because it was designed to be used in a submarine. Smakalka does not mean good.
No.
At the end of the day, the Krasny Kavkaz is lucky, very lucky, that it never had to face another surface ship in combat. But it also has a pretty damn brilliant track record. And although the hull was small, the engines were old and they were pretty slow, the guns were horrific, the accommodation for the crew as of all Soviet ships was quite dated and not great. And, you know, it's not exactly great being on a ship being run by a commissar. I kind of have a soft spot for this one. Thank you again to my patrons and members, you guys are amazing. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and join the Discord. And a huge thank you to Call of War for sponsoring this video. Remember to click the link in the description to choose your own strategy and engage in epic battles to fight your way to victory with your chosen country. Just remember that the 13,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription gift is only available for 30 days, so make sure you don't miss out.
I thought when he got into this that I was going to hear something truly horrifying, some massive tale of just absolute incompetence, but this is incompetence. This design is incompetence of a bureaucratic, more bureaucratic nonsense than really anything else. From what he was saying, the crew of this, and from what I was hearing, the crew of this ship, they were actually competent, which I'm always a fan of, regardless. I don't like it when people, it's a thing for me where I don't want to hear about people getting hurt because of just sheer incompetence. I don't want to hear about that. It bothers me, which is why certain things happening in the present day really do bother me in more ways than one. Because they shouldn't be going on in first place, and incompetence is making people suffer. But if this ship had fought anything, even destroyer tonnage, it would have gotten shreked. And it wouldn't even have been a close fight. It wouldn't even have been half of a fight. This thing would have been obliterated. And no, like, yes, the crew may have been a good crew, but when essentially you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back, you know, this ship is the equivalent, quite seriously put, of a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest because it had a third of the firepower, not nearly enough speed, and based off the fact that it was only around 7,000, a little over 7,000 tons. Sorry, 70,000. Oh my god, my brain. It was underweight and undergunned and slow versus anything it would have fought, including destroyers, including fleet escort destroyers, which were mainly anti-submarine in both mission and scope. This thing would have been beaten down by anything it fought. Warpugs, History of Everything tells us another glorious story of bureaucratic nonsense. But luckily this time, it's not accompanied by a bunch of people getting killed for no other reason than someone else's blatant stupidity. Warpugs, History of Everything has brought us another. This is actually kind of a good story. A good story where we get to laugh at the stupidity of those in charge, and people beneath them, for the most part, didn't suffer egregiously. And that's always a good thing. That's always a good thing. There's an old saying, you know, it's always funny until somebody gets hurt, and then it's hilarious. That's not the case for me. Warpugs, History of Everything's links are going to be in the description down below. Make sure you check them out. They have been a great friend to the channel. I actually got to sneak peek one of his latest things about sacred chickens in Rome. And I highly recommend you check that out because it will blow your mind if you didn't know about Rome and its obsession with poultry. And, oh my god, did it have an obsession with poultry. Warpugs, link, make sure you subscribe to History of Everything if you haven't already. Subscribe to me if you haven't. Check the links in the description below for, I have a new home, I have my new house. I got a wish list to try to get it filled in a little bit because I have some things it's going to take me a while to get everything that I need. And I'm getting stuff from that wish list myself. So, somebody told me to put it up here, so I am. Warpugs, I'm going to head out from here. I hope you have a great day. And yeah, I'll just catch you guys next time. I'm not slamming my head into my desk in mental agony because people died from people being absolutely stupid. And that's the best. It's good.